This episode of the Magdala podcast is sponsored by the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. The Catholic Theology Show covers themes such as the value of a Catholic higher education, religious liberty, how to pray, the philosophies of St. Thomas Aquinas, and more. Stream episodes on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and learn more by visiting the link below. Hey there, my name is Rachael Kalaki, and welcome to the Magdala podcast. We at Magdala know from experience that pornography, masturbation, and other sexual addictions are not just a guy problem. The need for women to be accompanied in a journey towards healing from addiction has gone sorely unmet, and that's why we're here. Magdala exists as a space where women can find hope, healing, and freedom alongside each other from sexual addiction. Our goal is to supply you with support, community, and accountability. Here on the podcast, you'll find everything from testimonies to practical advice to dialogue about how to heal and live fully as a Catholic woman. Wherever you are in your journey, know that you're not alone, and we welcome you to this table. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Magdala podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Julia Sadusky. I'm really excited for this conversation. Dr. Sadusky is a leading voice just in the topics of sexuality, gender, sexual development, specifically in the Catholic realm. But I'm just so excited to have her join us today to talk about sexual education. In Magdala, we come across the trauma that can come from a lack of sexual education or harmful sexual education all of the time. I think a majority of our women, a majority of our listeners just really experience this as a part of our story. So we're going to unpack that today. And just per usual, we're discussing very sensitive topics. So if you find that this is just triggering something in you, take this episode slowly, pray with the questions we're asking, think through what Dr. Sadusky is saying, but also read her book, which we're going to talk about. But first, Julia, I would love to just welcome you to the podcast and ask you to just share more about your professional background. And just kind of how you found yourself where you are right now.
Yes, it's so good to be with you, Rachel. I know we haven't gotten to meet in person, but we're such kindred spirits in our work. So it's exciting to be talking about this. A little bit about me. I'm a licensed psychologist in Colorado. I have a private practice here, and I was raised Catholic, a big Catholic family, one of 7 kids, and went to Ave Maria University in South Florida for undergrad. Shout out. And had a really overall positive experience there, just learning about human sexuality. I studied psychology there, and I started to see even then that as much as I was getting a ton of theological formation in human sexuality, I was picking up on gaps in how that practically applies in my own life and then in other people's lives when it comes to things like sexual development, sexual attraction, marriage, and all those pieces. So I think that started my journey of really trying to think critically about how do we take what we can from Catholic theology that is so helpful and also not stop there, but be able to look to the best of psychology as we understand human development and how to be healthy, whole sexual beings.
That's amazing. And so you've written several books at this point. The one that we're going to talk about today is not your first, but I'm excited to talk about your books that are honing in on sexual education and development and kind of filling those gaps. So you wrote Talking to Your Kids About Sex, and then you have Talking to Your Teen About Sex, which has just recently come out through Ave Maria Press. So just share a bit about those books and kind of what maybe you saw in your practice that sent you towards those. You were saying earlier that you actually hadn't even planned to write books on sexual education, which I think is great, or sexual development, but I'd love to just hear more about the inspiration behind those books too.
Yes, so much of my writing has been reactive or tries to be responsive to things that are front and center in the cultural milieu and conversation. So I've written a lot about gender and faith. And honestly, I was totally pitching a different book. And then I was getting calls from close friends and family members who were asking me questions about things I don't get to talk about too often, which is sexual development in young kiddos. So things 0 to 9. And questions like, my kids were at a play date and I walked in and one of the kids had their pants down and they said they were playing a game. and I panicked and didn't know how to respond. Or, my children were touching each other's genitalia when I walked into the room, and I screamed at them, and I don't feel good about that. How do I move forward from this? And, of course, a lot of my work as a psychologist is with Catholics who are navigating compulsive sexual behavior, pornography, masturbation, men and women alike. And I was seeing, maybe you could say, the impacts of a lack of sex education, and trying in my clinical work to work against that and fill in the gaps. And then I was hearing on the front end from families and friends the gaps and where those really start. And so I was thinking to myself, what is going to come in and help everybody across the board in this conversation? And so I did this first book, Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex, for parents of kids 0 to 9. And in my mind, it was a standalone book just to have conversations about sexual development, boundaries, physical touch, expectations, sleepovers for young kids. And then, of course, Ave Maria Press came back and said, hey, can you write 2 books, one for parents of kids 0 to 9 and one for parents of kids 10 to 18, which makes so much more sense than my idea, because I specifically work with teenagers a lot. So trying to think about conversations around sex ed, but also including things that I do specialize in, like compulsive sexual behavior, masturbation, pornography, same-sex sexuality, gender distress. And so you'll see in the books those pieces as well, which are really meant to be comprehensive of what's the crash course none of us got? And then in receiving that, how do we give out of that reception to vulnerable kids?
Right. And you talked about just parents' reaction to things like sexual play or sexual curiosity in their kids. And I remember a therapist telling me, just kind of in my own counseling experience, she was like, well, parents react from the moral framework that they have. Like, they react to sexual things from their adult understanding of sexuality. And oftentimes they're not thinking of what is the framework I'm creating for the child. Right. And that was incredibly redemptive and healing for me to hear, but makes me think, just in raising my own children, of like, okay, am I going to react to them in an adult way, and then all of a sudden kind of give them an adult dose of shame, an adult dose of the view of sexuality? Or am I going to give them a child's view, which is, okay, sexual play may not be a healthy choice, but it's a pretty understandable one for a child. They're learning their world. So I think there's just a lot to be said about like parents' reactions. And is that kind of what you're seeing, is that a lot of sexual education, you're receiving kind of this adult dose of shame from parents?
Yes, I would say that, right? Even if a kid has some level of discomfort in aspects of exploratory play, it is the ways that kids learn about their environment. And we do this with, we have that song, Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes, right? Like we're teaching them, touch your body to learn about your body. And then as soon as it goes into a realm that becomes reproductive, right? Once they hit puberty, the adult is reacting out of a sexualized interpretation of the touch. And it doesn't mean, again, that you don't provide scaffolding around the touch and you don't explain context and appropriateness of certain types of touch and behaviors that would not be appropriate. That's all critical in this. But the way you respond sets a map. And I see that time and time again clinically, that if you're not having any conversations about human sexuality, except for in the context of slapping a hand away or saying, what's wrong with you? Why would you do that? And then there's silence until puberty. You are setting a framework for how that person relates to their body. And it's bodily shame, in part, that can fuel sexual acting out of all kinds. And so if we want to help with chastity, and if we want to help with integration of sexuality into personhood, we have to start with neutrality when it comes to early body development. And that's a huge missing piece. And if adults are honest, most of us don't have that in our relationship with our own body. And so it becomes really difficult to give what you don't have. Not impossible, which is the point of these books, but definitely difficult.
Right. Yeah. I love the word scaffolding that you use too, of just like providing context, providing boundaries, providing like those, increasing levels of understanding, which I love. I love that your book is divided into two, or books are divided into two. And I got the title wrong. I apologize, of Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex, but I love that. Just start. Like it's, I think a lot of parents I've talked to who ask me, how can I speak to my daughters about pornography, about sexual behavior? Because I think they imagine in their heads that they have to do it all at once. Like I think that's how a lot of us were sexually educated, is it was one really big conversation.
That's right.
And Jay Stringer, who we were talking about right before we started recording, he said something brilliant. When I recorded with him once, he said, don't have one 60-minute conversation with your kids about sex, have 61-minute conversations where it's regular, it's normal, it's natural for you to talk about it. And I love that it's invitational. Like, start talking to your kids about sex. You don't have to do this all at once. Like this is an ongoing journey. Like you're meant to kind of mentor and accompany your child through their sexual development. They don't go through it alone. But I think, so many of us, because we have sexual wounds ourselves, are so afraid to accompany, because that would mean accompanying ourselves into those wounds. And that would be terrifying. But I see a lot of need for that. And could you just shed some light on the tie of what you're seeing? Like, cause I loved what you're talking about with slapping the hand away and then puberty happens and it's a totally different conversation. Could you talk more about like the tie between the trauma of a lack of sexual education and then how that ties into compulsive sexual behavior? Because that's what we see all the time in our community. And I would just love to hear more of your insights on that.
Yes. So Jay Stringer, who, again, he's a mental health professional specializing, right, in compulsive sexual behavior and lack of desire for sex, and how that shows up in different people. But he, in one of his first books, Unwanted, talks about some research he did with people navigating significant difficulties with compulsions and sexuality. And what he found was most people reported very little and very inadequate sex ed. And what they said is, I think it was 50% of people in his study reported very limited conversation with a mother, but it happened. And then 60% said they never talked with their dad about anything sexuality related. And only 8% said that their mom gave them sufficient sex ed, and only 5% said their dad did. And so you can just see a deficiency there. And I actually don't think that would be unique to people navigating compulsive sexual behavior. I just think it's one manifestation of the same, which is nobody taught me how to orient myself in relationship with my body. And I imagine women listening to this will relate to some of the clinical stories I can share, which are always a combination of a lot of people's stories. But, take a Catholic woman who says, I didn't even know I was self-stimulating. I didn't even know I was masturbating because nobody ever talked about masturbation except for in a male typical way. And so what was happening when I was self-stimulating, albeit pleasurable, it was merely pleasurable and confusing. And for many women, that happens even in play as they get a little bit older with other girls. And so how confusing to know this feels really good and it also feels really bad. And I don't have a framework. And men have shared this with me as well, self-stimulating on an object at some point, and then feeling the same way when they first get exposed to pornography, which is usually happening to them. They don't seek it out in I think most cases of pornography exposure. And so all of these things are in a way happening to these kids and teens. And then what they get at home is pornography is a mortal sin. Masturbation is a mortal sin. And there's no account for the lack of volition in these early exposures. And the trajectory of shame, the trajectory of isolation that we know fuels these behaviors is then metastasized in the home. And it's until they're in therapy with me or meeting with a psychologically minded spiritual director, where it first brought up that how can you commit a mortal sin at 6 years old? And how can you do that when it wasn't volitional? And you're telling me you disliked that. You didn't feel good about what you were seeing, but nobody asked you if you wanted to. They just did it. And it's so healing, and a first step towards healing for people to recognize that even when my body responds to stimuli that are meant to be responded to, that does not mean I desired the thing that happened to me or am culpable for those moments. Really critical in understanding the implications of those behaviors and also how they set a trajectory without our permission.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Everything you're saying, I'm nodding because you're just describing parts of my own experience, but also just so many experiences of women in our organization. And I started making it a habit in talks that I gave on pornography addiction for women to address that first exposure and try to tell them it wasn't their fault. And there are parts of my talks where women will cry. That's probably the biggest one, is to have somebody look them in the eye and say, this was not your fault. I think is that hits home because all of us carry that. That's what I was taught about pornography and masturbation, is this is a mortal sin, right? Which is true when it's freely chosen and freely understood, right? And totally chosen, which also that gets into addiction, that's difficult.
Whole other animal.
Yeah, that's a different podcast episode. But I think, I think just immediately feeling from chastity education, like any sexual sin or any sexual exploration, any experience of abuse is a moral failing, and that's it. And so you just need to confess it and get over it. Like there's just nothing holistic about that. And it traps people. So I think, and I think especially for women, like I was working with someone recently who just, a man who just really, I think, lacked the understanding and compassion for that, like as a parent, of just, teaching children about their sexual agency and not saying if you encounter pornography, but when, like you will, and I'm here for you when you do. And you may have a whole host of reactions to this, and I'm here for every single one of them, and I will walk you through any of them. I've experienced it myself. Like those are new conversations that parents are having. But this man that I was in dialogue with, he just he was like, you're acting like we don't catechize and we don't teach them about virtue and we don't. And I was like, yeah, well, we do, and it hasn't done anything. Like that's the point. Is like, I'm not saying don't catechize your children. I'm not saying don't teach them about virtue. But the point is we have been doing that, and it has not been enough. Like not even close. Most of the women who come through Magdala's doors, I'm sure most of the people who come into your practice are really wonderful, virtuous people. Like I work with really amazing, inspiring, virtuous, holy, faithful women. But it's not enough, So I think there's just a lot to be said about that of, the just framing sexuality as like either moral success or moral failure is just really not holistic. Yeah. And I'm just curious, where that line starts in sex ed of just like, or what you would recommend of like, when does that moral kind of education start? Because it does need to start at some point, but telling a 5-year-old something's a mortal sin, like, before the age of reason, like that doesn't make much sense. But like, when do you start seeing that kind of symbiotic relationship between morality, bodiliness, like, and even psychological formation and development? Like, where do you see the lines and the crossover starting?
Right. It's so interesting that even apart from any framework for morality, kids tend to feel an automatic reaction, for instance, to sexual abuse. Nobody has to say to them, that's wrong, because it's written on their hearts.
Yes.
And so the first thing I would say is cultivating an attunement to our hearts from a young age.
Yes.
Sets a trajectory for virtue because it is inscribed in the human heart and then cultivated through the sacramental life of the church. So giving your children access to the sacraments orients them towards the good, the true, and the beautiful in a more natural way. Concupiscence is real.
Yeah.
And grace is real. And helping kids know that grace builds on nature.
Yes.
And nature is impacted by harm. So our capacity to form the will is compromised by harm.
Wow.
Not
Wow.
absolutely, but in particular ways. And so we want to then create a framework as kids get older, much beyond the age of reason, right? Because if you're at 7, suddenly laying it thick that they are culpable for every behavior that is not God's best for them, that's where we can get into psychological concerns like anxiety, depression, scrupulosity, that we want to buffer against. And so, I think the biggest thing is, and this is the framework of the book, is how do you help your kids know that when they perceive that they have fallen short of the good, the true, and the beautiful, there's nowhere else you'd rather them go than to you.
Yes.
As much as it will be painful to hear, like, oh, you stole, or oh, you lied to me, or oh, you were exposed to pornography, or you were sharing pornography with your younger sibling, like, or you touched your younger sibling in an inappropriate way. Like, as much as it would be hard to hear, wouldn't you rather know than not know? Because then you get to speak into it. And then all you're doing is pointing the child back to the natural guilt that ought to be there. That hey, how did you feel when you did that?
Yes.
Well, I felt dirty. I felt disgusting. I felt like I wanted to hide. Oh my gosh. Well, wouldn't you know that that is what happens when we fall short of God's plan for us after the fall? Like you remember Adam and Eve in the garden? Like, what do? They hide themselves. And as humans, that's what we do when we pick up on the fact that what we're doing is not going to be freeing. And so that doesn't have to be a double shame where it's like, so now let me tell you a lecture on mortal sin. It's like, wow, look at how your body and your emotions actually are communicating something about God's best for you. And so let's talk about how to set you up for more freedom next time. Let's make a plan. When you feel bored next time and you want to go scrolling online and that doing that brings up certain images, or if you know that going to the gym can sometimes be triggering for you of other imagery. Actually, I would love if you go home and we talk about that. I would love to help be a receiver of those and help you problem solve how to address those things. And that's what we do in therapy, right? That's what you do in your ministry is let's make a map for how this happens to you and how you get yourself in these situations, or you find yourself in these situations, either or both. And then we can really get creative because sin, temptation is not more powerful than the human capacity to reason and to learn and to grow. And so again, do you see how I'm not sitting down with a 10-year-old and saying, hey, let's because fear-based approaches do not cultivate virtue. People don't stop speeding because they can get tickets. People don't stop speeding because they do get tickets. People stop speeding if they are cultivating a sense of human responsibility for themselves and other people.
Yes.
It's the same thing with chastity. So actually, I think to the gentleman you described, who's kind of like, well, wait, are you saying we don't catechize? It's like, no, we ought to catechize the way we catechize everything else. Which is, you only talked about justice, temperance, prudence. When people turn 13 in the abstract, you're not cultivating those virtues.
Right.
But if you can teach it when a kid is, playing with their genitalia in the grocery store, in the cart, and you reflect back, hey, I notice you touching that. What do you enjoy about that? What do you like about that? Oh, okay, that makes sense. It makes sense that feels silly to you, or that moves in a way that makes you laugh, or and that actually is a really important part of your body. And that part of the body we touch to clean, we touch to look at to make sure it's functioning well, because it's going to be really important throughout your life. And so we don't actually touch it in those ways, especially in public, because there can be germs and other things. I mean, do you see how it's just, you're infusing a sense of context for sexual behavior, even when it's not sexualized in a kid's mind. But you're not saying to them, hey, when you do that 10 years from now, to orgasm by yourself, that's going to be mortal sin. Just thought you should know, because we just don't find that actually helps people with living according to their values.
No.
So I wish it would be way easier.
No, it makes them hide. I think, in the discussion with this man too, it was like, what you're pointing to with parents and the ability to have those discussions, that means, and however difficult it is to hear that our kids have failed, that means we have to untether our kids' moral failure from our own, right? Which is hard. As hard as a parent. I only have a toddler and another one on the way, so I can only imagine how hard this is with older kids, but just untethering that identity enough to be like their moral choices are their own. I think there's no more tender spot for this than sexuality. Because in that discussion I was having, I was seeing I was trying to discuss how if a daughter loses her virginity prior to marriage or, engages in sexual behavior before marriage, or even afterward in a way that isn't honoring to a marriage, if she's in it, it is not a failure of the father. Because I think that was a kind of typifying that I have dealt with and still deal with in my work, but just that I had daddy issues. That must be my problem. I'm like, actually, no, I had an excellent father who's not perfect, but I have a wonderful dad. I had a great relationship with my dad. You can't chalk this up to daddy issues. I have individual sexual agency and I made choices in my agency. I was exposed to content that most of us are exposed to at this point, and I made choices out of that. And some of that isn't my fault, and a lot of that is. And so it's just kind of like this idea of stop seeing your children's sexuality as a place where you have to protect them. And then if they're exposed, like, oh my gosh, I'm a bad Catholic parent. And it's like, no, this is the good parent does what you just described, is receptive, is a sounding board, is a grounding place over and over, and is a welcoming, forgiving, merciful place when you do make a mistake. And I think more and more we're needing parents to be forthright with their kids about their own mistakes in a way that's honoring to their own story. But my husband and I talk about this regularly. Like, my kids, especially as a result of my work, will know about my mistakes. And I'm actually really relieved about that. I'm really relieved because hopefully that makes me, especially for my daughters, a safer space. I'm just like, yes, I completely understand why you feel the way you do. And I want to talk about that with you, and I want to walk through this with you. But I think if we can get parents to kind of move into that, and it requires a lot of self-compassion for their own stories and a lot of healing for their own stories, which is hard, but just that untethering of moral failure and that identity from their kids. But if they can move that energy, that passion, that desire to protect their children into also protecting them from shame after things happen, I think we would get somewhere like really fast. Because I think right. I see that so often, especially fathers when it comes to their daughters, because there's this beautiful heart for protection and guardianship. But that can turn into kind of almost a distorted lack of recognition of a daughter's sexual agency. And I think I'm thinking of that just because I primarily work with women, but I've seen so much of that. So just wanted to add onto that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so important to be able to not just detach your value from your children's decisions, but help them do the same with detaching and removing their sense of value, which is untainted. Their dignity, their worth, untainted and untouched from behavior. And we can't do that with our children, right. Or they won't believe us if it's hard for us to do that for ourselves. And so I often remind parents that nobody comes to therapy to process a harmful encounter with a parent who apologized, or a harmful encounter with a parent who, to the very best of their ability, stayed present where their feet were with their child. It's always my parent left, or my parent looked away, or my parent dismissed, or my parent invalidated, and they didn't own it. They didn't apologize. And so, for parents listening, obviously, these are places that we all make mistakes within. And it's actually the best opportunity in the world to be able to have the chance to go back and to say, here's how I'd like to apologize. Here's what I'd like to do differently in the future. I haven't honored your agency. I've made it about me.
Yes.
And that's how God sanctifies parents, right? Is detaching from those things in ways that are really difficult and really essential for a teen's development.
100%. I know we have to land this plane soon here, sadly, because I feel like this needs to be 4 or 5 different episodes. But just speaking to the women, just kind of in Magdala's community who are traumatized from their sexual education or lack thereof, where would you suggest they go now? Because I've been suggesting your book as a way to almost re-educate yourself. But I'd just be curious what your thoughts are from like a clinical standpoint of what can we do to aid in our healing in that area? What can we do with that lack of sexual education? And what are some resources you would recommend in addition to your own book?
Yeah, I would say, there's a really interesting movement in psychology right now, including secular psychology, around embodiment and trying to reconnect to embodiment. And so you hear that a little bit in what I'm saying. And I think it is, even though it doesn't account for concupiscence, I think it does account for the fact that even after the fall, right, connecting to embodiment can be, our body has a language, right? And it communicates to us about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so for women who are wanting to experience more healing, approaching yourself and your own embodiment with more neutrality. So I say neutrality because I think body positivity and body acceptance is a long shot when you've been trained for so long in self-disgust and self-loathing, which I'm guessing many of the women listening have experienced. And so just a turning toward, even after, let's say, after you fall into temptation or you get caught in a cycle, being able to turn back towards yourself and back towards that part of you who needs care, needs support, and needs receptivity.
Yeah.
Not so much affirmation, like, good job, you, this false positivity, but like, I want to see you here. I want to hear you here. I'm sorry for how hard this is. Because when we want to move towards virtue, the principle that promotes change is actually acceptance.
Yes.
Acceptance of self where we are. And I don't want listeners to assume that that's this kind of false affirmation or moral relativism.
Right.
It actually is the catalyst for moving towards our values in a more consistent way. Yep. But being able to really pay attention to the areas that activate you when thinking about sexuality, talking about it, even trying to read my books. I'm sure people reading will have a reaction inside. And just really taking note of those things, bringing those into prayer, bringing those into relationships with trusted people, therapists, spiritual directors who are psychologically minded, and tuning into what is trying to be communicated with us of what has been unmet and unattended to. And even just asking the question, like, what do you need from me? What do you need to hear from me? This part of us, right, that is hurting and wounded and did not get what she needed. Because I actually think a lot of what I share in the books is intuitive to the heart of every person. I hope people reading it will say, oh, yes, 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 I can do that. I can embody that. And entrusting that journey to the Lord, that we don't have to be where we think we need to be. We just have to be where He is with us, and He is with us actually where we are. So being able to be gracious with ourselves on a journey that is hard when you haven't gotten the formation you've needed, but not being defeated and hopeless in that, but saying, okay, I didn't get that. How do I move towards that now? And trust that may feel slow, but it's steps ahead of what it would otherwise be.
Amen. Amen. Well said. I think that's the perfect point to land on. And I'll put a link to Julia's books below if you want to hear more or order her book. Again, her newest one, Talking to Your Teens About Sex, is out. You said 2 weeks ago. It's recently out.
Yes,
congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I was super honored and happy to endorse that book. And I would love for people to read it, give it to parents in your life, recommend it to parents, recommend it as a parish resource. just for people in formation roles. I think it's just so beautifully compassionate and tender and informational. So can't recommend it highly enough. But thank you, Julia, so much for joining us and for your amazing work.
Thanks, Rachel. It's so good to talk to you.
If you like this episode, feel free to like, subscribe, or share with a friend. If you're interested in supporting the work that we're doing in Magdala and also gaining access to more exclusive content, consider joining us as a patron on our Patreon. You can find that link in the show notes below. If you'd like to support the work Magdala is doing as a donor, you can also find the link to join our support team in the show notes below. If you are in need of a Covenant Eyes subscription and want to give it a try, you can use the code Magdala for 30 days free. You can find that link in the show notes as well. To join a virtual small group or learn more about our resources, visit magdalaministries.org. And then finally, if you want to get the light phone and live a more peaceful life, you can find our affiliate link in the show notes below as well. God bless you all, and we'll catch you soon.